Good morning, St. Joan of Arc. Good morning. It's a beautiful day. We've been very busy, but here we are. So if we could just take one nice big deep breath. Breathing out slowly. And place yourself here. And Jesus said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. The Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, give sight to the blind, to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom to the captives and liberation to the oppressed." There's a movement happening in the world. It's bubbling up in the hearts of people in pain. When we come together, motivated by revolutionary love, knowing the pain of our planet and the agony of the poor, when we come together in the prophetic path of Jesus, we liberate each other. We free one another. We transform this broken world toward beloved community in the freedom of God. We are so pleased to have Reverend Jim Baird Jacobs with us this morning to share his story from oppression to liberation. Jim was born in St. Paul and is a member of the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Nation, an American Indian tribe located in central Wisconsin. He has degrees in pastoral studies and Christian theology and has served various churches as a youth minister, adult Christian educator, and director of men's ministries. Presently, he is the parish associate at Church of All Nations Presbyterian Church. He is a cultural facilitator in the Twin Cities and works to raise the public's awareness of American Indian causes and injustices. As the founder and convener of Healing Minnesota Stories, Jim initiates and is dedicated to creating events of dialogue, education, and healing, particularly within faith communities like our own. He is currently the Director of Racial Justice for the Minnesota Council of Churches, and we are so honored that you are with us this morning. Let's give Reverend Jim Baird Jacobs a good St. Joan of Arc welcome.
Good morning, church. How's everyone doing today? That's good. Well, when I was given this invitation to come and speak to you all, I went back in my memory banks and recalled that I have intersected with the St. Joan of Arc community a number of times throughout the years, probably going back 15 years now. Some of you look older, like you have harder. No judgment, but just an observation. You know, when one gets an invitation like this to speak about movement from oppression to liberation, if you're a public speaker, you have these dreams of saying incredibly wise things that land with the public, and you know, there'll be roaring applause and confetti will drop from the ceiling, and enlightenment will land upon us all. But you know, I'm self-critical enough to know that I'm an average public speaker. So hold your confetti today. But what I am is I'm a gifted storyteller. And so I would like to tell you a story about my own realization about my movement from oppression to liberation. No doubt you have heard the statement said at least once or twice in your life, "If I have seen farther than any other person, it is because I stand on the shoulders of giants." This is usually a statement that is made by someone who's standing at a podium behind a microphone, acknowledging the fact that while they are receiving some type of accolade, that the work was not done by themselves alone, that they follow in the footsteps of vanguards and pioneers who laid the work for them. And I am here to tell you a story about why that notion of standing on the shoulders of giants is not true for me. Now, make no mistake, I don't stand before you making any kind of claim that I'm a self-made man, that I pulled myself up by my own bootstraps, that I forged my own path in the world and owe my position to anyone. That is not the case. What I am here to tell you is that when it comes to standing on the shoulders of giants, it is not necessarily the case for me. So in order to tell you this story, I need to introduce you to my grandmother, who would have been 102 years old this summer. Now, shortly after my grandmother was born, her mother passed away. And my grandmother was sent to be raised by Aunt B. Now, I know what you're thinking. Aunt B must be short for Beatrice. Her name is spelled B-E-A. That is not the case. It is B, period, and to this day we don't know what the B stands for. So grandmother is sent to be raised by Aunt B. Now Aunt B is deaf and mute. And so for the first few years of my grandmother's life, her and Aunt B developed a rudimentary sign language which mostly entailed writing letters and symbols on the palms of Aunt B's hand and communicating that way. Now, Aunt B was what is called a domestic for a logging camp. That's her job. And a logging camp is quite simply a camp of anywhere from 25 to 50 men who hopscotch around the big woods of Wisconsin harvesting the lumber. And you can imagine what life would have been like for Aunt B. One of the only women, if not the only woman, in a camp of anywhere from 25 to 50 men. Now add to that, as I mentioned, Aunt B was deaf and mute. She cannot hear anyone approaching. She cannot cry out for help. You can imagine the untold humiliations and dehumanizations that Aunt B faced. And in the midst of this, because of the death of my great-grandmother, my grandmother is being raised in this logging camp. And one night, when grandmother and I were driving around, it's one of our favorite things to do when I would visit. We would just drive around our reservation and she would tell me stories. And we crossed this area where an old logging road went off into the woods. If you've spent any time in the woods, you know these old logging roads. They're just two tire tracks that go out into the woods. 60 years ago, this is where the logging company would haul their timber out, but they've been disused forever now. And we crossed one of these old logging roads, and Grandma says, back there is where we escaped from when I was a child. What'd you say, Grandma? I pull over to the side of the road because you cannot just drop words like we escaped from and then move on to another subject. I pulled over and I said, "What are you talking about? Tell me the story." And she told me how she was raised in this logging camp by Aunt B, and how the foreman of the logging camp was a very jealous, very possessive man. And at some point when my grandmother was 4 to 5 years old, she perhaps caught the eye of the foreman or another man in the logging camp. And that night, Aunt B woke my grandmother up by covering her mouth so she wouldn't cry out, and in their rudimentary sign language said in her hand, "It is not safe here for you. We need to get you out." And so Aunt B pulled my grandmother onto her back, and they walked out of that man camp. Now remember, Aunt B cannot hear, and the foreman is very possessive. So my grandmother, my young grandmother, had a very specific job. Any time that my grandmother heard a car approaching, she would tap Aunt B on the shoulder, and they would rush down into the ditch and cover themselves with the underbrush until the car had passed and it was safe again. And as Grandma's telling me this story, I say, "Grandma, how far did Aunt B carry you?" And she said, "I'll show you, because our ultimate destination is up the road here a ways." And so I marked the distance on my odometer, and Aunt B carried my grandmother for a distance of 6 miles. 6 miles through the dark Wisconsin woods, diving down into the ditch anytime a car approached, saying prayers that this would not be their discovery. And they finally reached the house of another relative who has agreed to take the child rearing responsibilities for my grandmother from this point out. My grandmother showed me where that house was and told me the story of that evening, as essentially responsibility was transferred from Aunt B to another relative. And I asked my grandmother, what did Aunt B do? What happened to Aunt B? My grandmother said, "Well, Aunt B went back. She went back." Now, you're probably just as confused and shocked as I was. Why? Why, when you have known oppression? Why, when you have been held captive to dehumanization, to abuse, to humiliation, and now you know liberation, now you have escaped, you are free? Why? Why in God's name would you go back? And I asked my grandmother, why would she go back? And my grandmother said, because it was 1925, and we were Indians. And maybe the context that is eluding you right now, see, in the mid-1920s, American Indians in this part of the country had only a 50% chance of raising their children. Because at that time, fully 50% of American Indian children were removed from their families and adopted to white families. 50%. One of the surest ways that you could ensure that your child would be taken from your family is if you could not on paper show that that child was financially supported. And Aunt B's job, as humiliating, as dehumanizing, as barbaric as it was a job. It was a paycheck. And it was a way to prove on paper that my grandmother was financially supported. So, having tasted freedom, having experienced liberation, Aunt B made an unbelievably altruistic decision, and she went back. If Aunt B doesn't go back, my grandmother gets removed from her family. If my grandmother is removed from her family, she never meets my grandfather. If she never meets my grandfather, my father is never born, and if my father is never born, I don't have the opportunity to stand before you today. So if I have seen further than any other person, if I have known beyond any other human, if I have been more liberated than anyone else in my family, it is not because I stand on the shoulders of giants, it is because I was carried on her back. And as we collectively, together as the loving family of God, think about how we move our world from oppression to liberation, let us remember, we are not here alone. We were carried to this moment by grandmothers, by great-grandmothers, by aunties. We were carried to this moment. And let us remember that sometimes we here have to make sacrifices so that others may live and know the beauty of liberation that we may not yet know. May it be so.